to go ahead and have a call-in show where we talk about just whatever is on viewers' mind. So I am going to post the phone number, and if there's something that you want to chat about, if you want to rip into me with the direction the channel's taken, or if you want to just talk about things that you have experienced, then you can call 210-422-2222. Let me make sure my Google Voice setup is working, and we can chat. In the meantime, since it's good to have something to talk about while we're waiting, every once in a while I'll come across an idea that I think is worth kind of tossing into the mix of, in the case of my more usual community, the ex-Mormon community. The largest ex-Mormon community is the Facebook Mormon Stories podcast community group, just in terms of where people go to talk stuff. Okay, hold on, I'm getting comments about mic issues, so let me check that, see what the deal is. If I have technical times during this podcast, I'll be pretty upset. Okay. Let's see. I can probably delete this. I have this funky audio setup that unfortunately gives me some problems sometimes. Okay, so output device, input device, and that goes to StreamYard speakers. I need a StreamYard mic device. Okay. Let me see what I can do for that. Okay, show sidebar. Oop. Okay, output device. Oh, there it is. StreamYard mic. Okay. And that seems to be working. Audio device, StreamYard mic. So if I go here. Oh, okay, yeah. I had a problem. StreamYard mic. Boom. All right, that should fix it. And okay, so sorry about that technical thing. Hope if you guys let me know if the sound is better now. And going back to it again, if you want to chat, see what's on your mind, call 210-422-2222, and we can see what has been happening. I got a 5x5. All right, very good. So back to what I was talking about. So occasionally I'll come across an idea that I think is worth getting some feedback on, just saying, hey, what do you guys think about this? And a meme crossed my view, which was this brilliant meme of a really happy, cheerful, curious little monkey, Curious George, who we're all familiar with from the children's books, coming across and playing with these relics from horror movies out of the 80s and 90s, and there, I think the Walking Dead is there too. And it's just the juxtaposition of the happy monkey playing with something that we know is inherently dangerous, I thought was a really powerful meme sort of thing. And so I created a version of it that kind of had a little bit of punch, but the idea was that there can be things that we may not be aware of, their downsides or the problems that they have when you dive into them, and you can kind of toy with them and play with them, play with their ideas, play with their terms, play with their concepts, not really knowing what's at the other end of that stick. And so I'll toss it up here. Let's see here. Okay. And the kind of the couplet that I added with it was something that I tried to have some symmetry to it so that it would have a little bit of catchiness. And that is, if you abandon your tradition after careful study of its problems, be careful adopting a new one without careful study of its problems. And if you've been following the channel for the last year or so, we've been going into some of the different philosophies, the different social movements that stand in as a new moral framework for people after they leave Mormonism, when they try to position themselves in the world as good people. Mormonism has its own inherent moral framework, and when you step outside of that, you look around and you try to adopt a new way to be good, to see the world, and position yourself in it in a moral way. And it's a very normal human impulse that we all have. But it turns out there's a whole bunch of different philosophies, each of which carries its own ideology and its own dogma about what it means to be good, what constitutes the good, or if even good can actually exist. And a lot of talking points from each of these different philosophies make their way into the discourse that we see in social media and conventional discussions that we have with people. And sometimes you can kind of like some aspects of those terms and really get into them, really identify with them. But if you haven't really dug deep to know what is bundled with those ideas, you may be actually playing with something that's a little bit more dangerous than you thought. Much in the same way that we have this happy little monkey playing with these things that we know are inherently dangerous. So let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. I might be able to boop, 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 boop. Okay, so we're going to zoom in a little bit on this one. So the first one, of course, is postmodernism, and we've got our curious little monkey who's, thinking about playing with those games. We can say that the language is, or the world is, truth doesn't exist. Everything is simply an assertion, and that we can socially construct our world through language games and all the other things that carry along from that idea. The image that we have there is the Necromonicon from the Evil Dead series. Again, it can be really exciting when you first tap into these ideas where you can, disconnect from any notions of objective truth and really just realize that everything is negotiated and reconstructed in the context of the cultural and social political times, and that power dynamics are really what structures society. And so you have to look at who benefits from claims of truth. All those things are fun to toy with it at first, but when you see what's on the other end of that, that's where you may not actually want to be toying with those ideas, or at least you want to have a sense of where something stops being a fun thought experiment and runs up against the wall of reality and things that we actually have to say do constitute truth and do constitute reality, and how we can kind of separate those things. The next one is intersectional feminism, and here we've got our happy, curious little monkey who's come across an egg pod that has a face hugger on it. This is imagery that, if you dive into the psychology of movies and everything, the Alien movie was one that people, and feminists in particular, have talked a lot about, because the idea that an animal would implant an embryo in somebody that would grow and turn into this combination of them, which is the science behind, the pseudoscience behind the alien thing, people have said is a metaphor for rape or for pregnancy, and how women feel being violated in that way. And so there's a whole bunch of people that have delved into that and see that as part of that mythology and part of the psychology of those movie series. And so that's why, of course, this would be the appropriate one for intersectional feminism. But the point here is, it's not just, I think when I first encountered all the ideas, I thought, oh, you're either, a misandrist or a bigot or something, or you're a feminist. And the feminists are the ones who want equality, and that's good. And it just seems like this, there's this world of feminism, and it's just this unified, they know what's good and right. And so you can call yourself a feminist, and it's as simple as that. Why would anyone not want to be a feminist? But when you start to see the feminists fighting with each other, you realize that there are different schools of feminism, and there are different movements within feminism, and there are different ideas that separate those movements. And that when you dig into, wait a second, what's the difference between the first wave, second wave, and then third or fourth wave? And what we're now seeing being billed as the true feminism being this intersectional feminism. So you may toy with some of the ideas of feminism, railing against the patriarchy and seeing the world as a dog-eat-dog battle between the sexes. And then when you dig deeper and see, wait a second, where does this go? If we follow it all the way through and we adopt each new movement of feminism, we end up within the world of intersectional feminism, where the category of woman itself seems to be disappeared under new language, new ideas that incorporate trans ideology into feminism, so that concepts such as the cotton ceiling and the colloquially termed girl dick become part of the discourse and define who is good and who is bad based on those things. And those are ideas that when you encounter them at first, they seem absurd, but then when you hear the ideological rationalization which justifies them, you see that there's an internal sort of logic to it, but it's based on assertions, on statements about the world and about ideas that are essentially opinion. they try to describe how the world should be, but it's ultimately just an assertion. It's not something that is an objective fact. And so it's fun to toy with those ideas, but you have to at some point draw a line somewhere, unless you want to go all in and identify completely with that. But I think when you see the level of infighting that happens in most of these things that, you know, we may discuss today, you realize that, you know, social movements and ideological movements that can seem appealing at a superficial level may be enticing. You want to jump on board, you want to identify with it, you want to go out and fight for it, particularly when it shows up under the heading of things like social justice. But when you see the bad parts of it, when you see the conflict, the chaos, the ideas that go to places you may not have intended to go when you first stepped foot in the water, then you got to be careful, because what you may find yourself doing is ultimately aligning yourself with a movement that betrays the very reasons that you left your old tradition. And I think like the classic example of this would be people who, on studying church history, figure out that Joseph Smith, you know, seduced or enticed or manipulated young women to be his illegal, you know, extra wives. And they did it in a coercive way. He completely manipulated and, you know, sexually assaulted, took advantage of these, what were essentially children, you know, young girls. You hear about the girl who, a few months shy of her 15th birthday, married Joseph Smith. And you're like, all right, I don't want to have anything to do with any religious leader claiming divine authority to sexually prey upon children, because that's just ridiculous. So then you step out into the wider world, you start learning about the new morality rooted in these movements, and you learn about queer theory and the luminaries of queer theory, you know, in particular Judith Butler, Michel Foucault, who is coming out of the postmodern tradition, is the grandfather of queer theory. And you start to see these people as luminaries, and you're like, wow, this is really great. I think the first time this triggered for me was seeing Lindsay Hansen Park post on her Facebook page that she was celebrating Judith Butler and what a great person she was, and she's just this great luminary. But when you look at the writings and the beliefs and assertions of the founders of queer theory, what they're railing against is not so much gayness versus straightness, it's normalness. And social norms are seen as oppressive, and the liberatory mode of existence, the way you free yourself from that oppression, is to intentionally target and disrupt those social norms. Then you have to ask yourself, what are the social norms they're trying to disrupt? What are the ones that you couldn't disrupt? And that's why a lot of the early postmodern queer theorists were against restrictions on the age of consent for sex between adults and children. And it started, you know, you see it widespread in the 60s, and it shows up every once in a while, and it seems to always trace its way back through those luminaries. So if you have people who reject Joseph Smith because he preyed upon children, but then they go and dip their toe and play in an ideology that provides justifications philosophically, not divine, but philosophically, for sanctioning sexual relations between adults and children, then you have to say there's something not consistent in terms of the way that you're approaching these issues. And so that's kind of one of those things. There's a video on the channel here about queer theory and pedophilia, and it goes through 4 key figures in the founding of queer theory and their writings on issues like the age of consent, abolishment, as well as the taboo on incest, and the way that they frame those as social norms that should be disrupted. And you can see that you know, that if that's where you're going, if the concept here is that you can't really just pick up one end of the stick. If you're going to pick up an ideology, if you aren't aware of where it goes and what the other end of the stick is, you may identify with and adopt ideas and beliefs that you ultimately wouldn't necessarily agree completely with. And so you've got to at least be aware of that so you can figure out where and if to draw the line. While we're talking, I guess I do want to remind viewers that if you want to chime in either on this subject or on anything else, you can call 210-422-2222. And in the meantime, we'll look at another one of our monkeys, and that will be Scientism. This is one that has become probably more popular in the past couple of years. Because, many of us think, well, we use our rational logical mind to analyze facts about church history, and we see that it conflicts with it. The claims that the Book of Mormon makes and that Mormonism makes are contradicted by science, and we take a rational empiric worldview and we say science is the way that we move forward. So then we move out of the church into the wider world, and we can use science as our guiding light. But then you start to realize how the concept of science, the authority of science, is itself subject to being manipulated and to be held up as kind of a fetish where you can then justify the things that get justified based on claiming that science did it without seeing science as a process, a method to try to ascertain truth, to try to examine claims to see if they're justified, and to test hypotheses. You rather see it as an authority, no different from a divine authority. It's just kind of a black box that you say, well, science says it, trust the science. We have to trust the science. And it's a complex picture. You can't simply say, I believe in science and think that it is as simple as that, because people are claiming to use science for all sorts of things. So that's one that I think we as a society have to always wrestle with, and it's always good to step back and remind yourself about some of those fundamental principles of seeing science and claims to science as a method for ascertaining truth. And so you cannot kind of stop yourself from continuing to ask those critical questions that would potentially disprove claims. And look at the nature of the evidence, look at the strength of the evidence, look at the justifications that are being used to put forward certain assertions, because all of those things can be disrupted and manipulated in the world of science, particularly when we see the concept of idea laundering, where we take the basic building blocks of how we as a society structure and replicate and disseminate scientific conclusions through the academic journals. If that process becomes ideologically poisoned, distorted, well, then our understanding and our ability to rely on science can be, ideologically distorted. And so we may find that we're relying on claims published in journals that we don't realize have been ideologically captured by any of these other movements, and so are intentionally publishing things that skew findings or that skew results or that hide or have a bias that goes unnamed and unchecked in a particular direction. And don't think that this can't happen, because we've seen it happen historically. And if you just Google Lysenkoism, and you can see how the ideology of post-revolution Russia infected its academic centers so that they lost a great deal of productivity in the way that their agricultural system was designed, because they were incorporating their political ideology into how they manage their academics. And it's part of why it was such a destructive and murderous political movement. And that then was carried over into China. So there's, simply holding up science as this thing that you don't question is kind of missing the point. The point is that you continue to question. So, all right, so let's keep going. Socialism, of course, touch on that. I think that's one of the ones that's easiest to see because, well, I don't know. I guess I could say maybe the reason it was just mind blowing to see a Mormon Stories podcast episode where John Larson, who, everybody has said so many great things about, it's just the more, his old podcast was the best. And we see this guy, and I never listened to the old podcast. So my only exposure to him has really been on Mormon Stories podcast. But then to have him say he's an outright socialist, and, I question my political views in my journey coming out of the church. And so, I spent some time saying, well, maybe this socialism thing is the way to go. Let me look and see how that's played out over history. And it's just remarkable in how it doesn't. And then looking at the economic side of that, I think the Austrian Economic School, which kind of drilled down on the idea that prices themselves can be a signal to the market that tells where resources should be allocated, and that socialism, which removes that decentralized calculation of the price of things, is kind of like the root cause that causes things to be misallocated and leads to all sorts of problems. Like that doesn't go away. And so I don't know. That's just something that, again, there's a lot of great things about many of these different concepts, but you have to also be aware of the downside of it. And that's true of socialism. It's true of critical theory, which was taking the conflict ideas of Marx that were applied towards the economic realm and blowing them up to see the entire culture and society as being divided between the oppressors and the oppressed, and developing a critical consciousness to be able to see with new eyes, be able to become awoke to those new ways of understanding the nature of oppression and how it permeates all of our institutions, and to see the world simply as this conflict between the oppressors and the oppressed, and to blow that up then into every realm of our existence. So you'll have critical race theory, you'll have queer theory, you'll have, fat studies, and all these different schools of thought, post-colonial theory, all of these different things, are just sort of fill in the blank repastes and recopies of the original critical theory paradigm. There's a video on the channel called Marxist Mad Libs that kind of shows that dimension of it. So again, there are some fun, interesting ideas, some fascinating concepts that you can get by reading about it, and it maybe will open your eyes to different aspects of society that are problem, but then it prescribes a way for you to move forward and how society should be shaped that is ideologically driven. It's not something that has the advantage of being tested and having it have a degree of success. Secular spirituality, I think this is one that it can be really tempting to adopt. There's a fantastic documentary called Hail Satan, which looks at the Satan's temple, looks how they've been using a kind of cheeky form of activism to try to draw distinct lines between the separation of church and state. And there's a lot of good work that they've done in terms of whenever the state tries to incorporate a particular brand of religion into the machinery of the state, well, they come along and they say, okay, well, if we're going to allow religion, then you got to allow Satanism too. And what it ends up doing is kind of causing the state to say, hold on a second, we don't want to go there. We're going to keep that division between church and state. And so there's, some really good ideas that come out of that. But then there's, near the end of the documentary, you start to see the infighting and division, and there's a strong trend to see social justice as the new morality in that movement, and it carries a lot of the same social dynamics that tear apart any organization, with purity spirals and inquisitions, and so that's without even going into how some of the secular spiritual realms have their own issues with child protection, because predators and abusers will exploit any system that doesn't have appropriate safeguards in, and they'll particularly when there's this idea that people in authority or people who claim some guru status or special enlightened status can be trusted, and that just is a place of vulnerability that tends to lead to abuses. And then finally, we move to activism, which has our little Pennywise clown trying to tempt somebody in there. Okay, hold on. I think I might be getting some calls that I'm just missing, but I don't know. Your browser might be... Change your browser. Okay, hold on. Okay, settings, calls. Settings. Okay, hold up. There might be a reason why I'm not getting calls. Okay, I think somebody has tried to call. I'm going to try calling them back. We'll see if we can hear anything. 1020.
Please leave your message for 801.
All right, we'll wait and see. I think receiving calls. Okay. All right. Well, we'll see. If you're calling, try calling again, and hopefully, hey, there we go. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Hey, I can. Yeah, I think the viewers can hear you as well. Oh, what's on your mind? What can I call you?
Thanks. So my name's Hiram. I'm probably the caller that, based on the area code, it seems like you're trying to call me, so I'm glad I was able to get through. I have a couple questions for you, but before I jump into those, I wanted to thank you. You've probably been I would say the most important personality, or the most important, I guess, person out there playing with ideas and with epistemology, I think. And as I've, at least to me, and in my path out of Mormonism, there were some deep dives you did on things like the Happiness Letter and the Mormon Prosperity Gospel that were really big. And then even when you get in with some of the other personalities like Bill Reel and RSM, I find that your approach is markedly different, and really resonated with me. As somebody who I guess hasn't been as quick to embrace the political ideologies that often go along with deconstruction of Mormonism, and I feel like your more epistemological approach has really been helpful to me, and I wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, well, that's great to hear. What is on your mind? I'm glad that there's a variety of approaches that are out there. So people like Bill Reel and John DeLynn, they kind of have their own focus, their own approach to things. And one of the things I'm trying to do is give a different flavor of that and have it reflect just the type of care that I try to give these subjects for it. So I'm glad to hear that that's resonating with some people and that it's been helpful for you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I guess the first question off the top of my mind is, and again, not to go back to some of the other figures, but I remember the RFM debate with the Midnight Mormons, and our RFM was asked quite pointedly, I think, well, what alternative are you offering? And I don't know that it's necessarily fair to require somebody to offer an alternative, but I am curious about what alternatives have appealed to you. Some of the things that I've looked at are Stoicism. I took some philosophy classes when I was at college, and I kind of delved back into that. Kant's categorical imperative has really been helpful to me. But and I understand it's probably under construction for you personally, but if you do have a framework or an approach, something that you've replaced Mormonism with, and kind of a formal religion with, I would love to hear about that.
Well, it's I think a common discussion and a common question, and I think the thing that probably guides me is just having been completely all in a religion that has a fundamentalist kind of literal concrete bent to it and has some of that undue influence dimension to it. I'm just really wary of joining up or completely meshing my identity with any movement or any group. So I have just a huge deal of skepticism about that. And but at the same time, I think I've evolved over time to try to recognize the good aspects of religious and faith traditions, seeing that they represent something more than simply the truth claims. The truth claims are there, but what they actually represent in the lives of people is something more and different from that. And that there can be value in those things even beyond the truth claims. And it's a little bit hard to go back into the mode of a believer to do that, but to then see that people in other faith traditions that have taken a much more pragmatic, metaphorical, it's not so much what is objectively true, but what may be true in principle or what may be good in application in their life. and seeing value in that. And so I kind of see myself, or I try to see myself as really just open and curious to any and all movements. And still, though, trying to hold on to principles that I think have the best chance of promoting prosperity and hopefulness and stability in my life. And as I'm trying to guide my kids through their own transition from childhood to adulthood to the later stages of life, I think just being open to that. And a big part of that journey, going from one mode of existence to the other, was really kind of opened up by listening to the debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. And it was realized Sam Harris is very stuck in this mode of what is objectively true, what is absolutely true using rationality. And Jordan Peterson was not even entering that realm and was looking more at what promotes a stable, productive life that that is worth living and can pass on to future generations. And it's kind of a much more evolutionary perspective. And I think seeing that there's some value in that and that that's something to pay attention to has allowed me to revisit what religions can represent in the lives of people, and to remain giving a much more charitable view of religion in general and people who feel very strongly and passionately about their connection to those religions. And so it's still hard for me to join anything. Like, I still have a hard time being in a group and chanting things in unison. But doing that, I still see myself as Christian in my general worldview and outlook. And, I resonate a great deal with the principles of love, compassion, charity, all of those things that were instilled in me from my Mormon upbringing. And so I still carry those values with me, and I try to look at the world with that lens. And so I just try to find things that I think will work for me and for my family. And I've talked about it a few times, but for me, a big part of that was the community theater run by one of the Lutheran churches in our neighborhood. And they take it's not proselytizing centered. So that's been what I've been involved with. But even then, I'll help with their live streams on their Sunday services, but I have a hard time going to services or participating in liturgy and things like that. So I don't know. Some of it has been trying to replicate the things that were meaningful in the Mormon tradition that I grew up with from a different realm. It's a little bit more isolated than having the community of a church. And so I've started to rely a lot more on my extended family for that community. But I don't know. I mean, what are some of the challenges and the ways that you've found to solve that dilemma?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you brought up the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debate. That's something that at a earlier stage in my in my religious journey, enabled me to stay in Mormonism for probably another 3 or 4 or 5 years. Jordan Peterson talked about, I'm not sure if it was in that debate or in another, but he talked about different conceptualizations of truth. Maybe the objective truth allows you to go to the moon, and maybe there's another truth for a group of people that doesn't, perhaps not as technologically advanced. But if your truth allows you to go to the moon, also leads you to develop technology like nuclear weapons that could eradicate life on the globe, maybe that's objective truth and not as useful as the truth that provides a helpful mythology and origin story. I still that still resonates to me, or with me rather, to a degree. But one of the difficulties I have is kind of goes back to the definition of good. What is objective good? Is it prosperity? that's certainly not a new philosophical question. And another issue that I have is whether I'm able to replicate the good from organized religion without the buy-in that's required by that religion. There's this concept in Plato's Republic of the noble lie, and it allows a society to kind of all row together, but it requires that people in that society believe the noble lie. So I don't know. There's this conflict here for me, because I would love to be able to remain certainly culturally Christian. I would love to hold on to some of the things that I think are strong positives from my Mormon experience, but I struggle with carrying those over. Now that I'm out of the church, I struggle with carrying those over without that buy-in. And even if I can do it, can I get my two daughters to do it? Can I, can my family buy in without a literal belief?
Yeah, I think that question of the next generation is an important one, and something that it's easy to lose sight of if you take the standard, what is kind of like the standard modern ex-Mormon journey, which is that you grow up in the church, you have your young adulthood in the church, and then in your middle age years, you discover the truth and you go out. That's kind of like the 2000 to 2012 pattern. Now we're seeing that happen a lot earlier, or the children of the people who did that. It's like those of us who left in our middle age had the benefit of some of the stabilizing principles and values that Mormonism carries over, that maybe they don't depend on a divine claim, but they're incorporated into the culture of Mormonism because they're found in our wider Western culture historically and have the effect of stability and prosperity within an individual life and intergenerationally. And so we may, as middle-aged people who've already been saturated and formed by those values, leave the church and still have a degree of stability, a degree of maturity. But then we've dragged out kids and other people who haven't yet understood the value of those things. Yeah. And so they come out and they are being pulled even more strongly by different modes of being, different movements. And for me, like one of the more obvious ways that you can see this happening are where they don't value the principle of freedom of speech. And they are heavily in favor of silencing and censoring speech that they consider to be harmful, and that they are equating speech with violence and using that as justification for effecting violence on the basis of speech. And so, those are concepts that are, kind of core values if you grow up in the church. Even if, you don't agree with with a Mormon, he'll still defend the idea that you should be free to disagree. And so that's something I think that I worry about more. And it's made me realize that whereas we could kind of be lazy as parents in the church, where we knew the values that the church was going to instill into our kids, and by going every week, and they were going to get that same installation of those values, in addition to all the Mormon baggage, the proprietary Mormon baggage. When you step out of it, then if those values were still important, you can't be in the same mode of assuming that somebody else is going to instill the values that you think are worth passing on to your children. You have to now be very much more intentional in sitting with your kids or finding ways to instill those values that are important to you. And, I think a lot of us are struggling with that.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think the last thing I want to do is monopolize your show, Jonathan. I guess my last question I'd like to ask is that I kind of see you being in a little bit of a unique space where you have like this talking relationship, at least with some of the more active current member content creators, but then you're also going on shows with prominent voices in the ex-Mormon community, and I guess with other prominent voices in the ex-Mormon community, and you have views that don't align with kind of the well-defined battle lines that each side has. For example, I think many of the topics that you've already discussed in your show, like queer theory or current feminism or postmodernism, I think might not play so well with a lot of the ex-Mormon community. And I would just be interested in kind of your opinion of where you see yourself. Are you in a no man's land, or are you playing on a totally different board now, where you're more interested in the pursuit of truth and knowledge and maybe epistemology, how we know what we know? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Okay, sure. I'm getting some feedback that there's an echo on your line, so I don't think that's your fault. I think it's probably something with my setup here. I haven't done a call-in show in a while, so I think I have to tweak my audio setup. But in terms of where I position myself and kind of what I see things, I saw the division and the battle lines drawn around that Midnight Mormons debate, and how each side was not willing to really give the other side or cede any ground. And I that was a form of discourse that I was not a fan of. And I thought that, of all the people who are kind of out there and risking themselves, like the Midnight Mormons were doing it, in a much more contemporary, active way than Fair Mormon ever was or had. And they're actually engaging with people, and they're willing to talk to ex-Mormons as well. They have their rough edges, certainly, but they're having fun conversations. And so I wanted to be a part of that. And I think doing that, you kind of have to play at their level in terms of being willing to have fun, being willing to take punches. And then if they see that you can take some punches, they're going to they're going to give back as well. And so that was something that I kind of put my toe in the water in challenging Cardin to let me on, and he did. And I think the dialogue that's come from that is really positive. And part of that is really taken from the ideas that Peter Boghossian put out in How to Have Impossible Conversations, which is a book where he talked about this very question of how do we bridge the gap between people who have just very diametrically opposed views on certain things. What are ways that you can facilitate communication and dialogue so that people can understand each other better, and through that process can humanize each other better, and then not start to see themselves as adversaries or enemies, but really start to see people in a much more human frame that I think makes it easier for us to look for truth together. And so that is kind of the way that I want to do it. And so that was the beginning of me being able to reach out there. And I think we're seeing other people take similar steps. I think Bill Reel recently has made fantastic headway in forging a connection with Jacob Hansen and having some dialogues where you can see where some of the things that ex-Mormons may take for granted about how, how much better their worldview is than Mormonism get pushed up against a little bit. And it kind of causes you to scratch your head a little bit. Jacob Hansen is not the easiest person to talk to, and he's softened his style over time. And I think that it's probably the right time for Bill to be able to engage with him in that regard. But just getting to know each of these personalities more, and myself seeing them as more human, has made it a lot easier to have dialogue with them and to give them the respect and the charity of their perspectives. But I think ultimately, if you were to say, what do I see myself as, I want to be kind of a gadfly, like somebody who sees where there's a soft part in some way that we're believing and says, hold on a second, let's push on that soft part and see if there's a reason for that being a problem. So I think that's why I tend to kick the hornet's nest regardless of which side that I'm on. To me, the interesting and fascinating conversations and learning about ourselves and learning about the things that we've started to hold on to outside of Mormonism involves understanding both the good and the bad aspects of it. And that the reflection of that then is looking back on the church and seeing the good there as well. And I found that taking that approach has helped me to maintain better, healthier connection with my family who remain in the church. And I think has led me to see things a little bit differently in the wider ex-Mormon world. I feel a little bit more secure about not necessarily hooking my wagon up to any particular movement, but just taking things very slow, being very skeptical as I can, but still holding on to the values that I have found to be useful in my own life. And that's why, you'll hear a great deal of skepticism about some of the things that tend to be like those hot ex-Mormon things, like polyamory and drug use and a bunch of other different things that I just say, hold on a second, there's other ways to evaluate something other than whether or not it's technically possible or within somebody's rights. There's dimensions about whether or not it promotes stability, long-term prosperity and happiness within an individual's life or intergenerationally. And so I can just carry all those different things with me as I talk with whoever. And I'm willing to talk to pretty much anyone who will have me as time allows. But anyway, I appreciate your call, Hiram.
Yep. Thank you. Nice to meet you, Hero. Thanks again.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Okay. Let's see. Why would we be getting an echo? Echo. I think that should not be happening. This is going to StreamYard mic. If you want to call in, you can call 210-422-2222 and tell me what's on your mind. If I go to my audio here, I've got StreamYard speakers, StreamYard mic, and StreamYard mic has audio coming in from the Google Voice speaker. And over here we have that microphone, speakers. Yeah. All right. I don't know what the deal is. Okay. So finishing up our little meme here. Activism. Okay, this is the one that people pushed back quite a bit and said, hold on a second, activism isn't even a philosophy. All right, here we go on. And we got this. All right. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me? Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, this is Dave from Utah.
Hey, Dave, how's it going? What's on your mind?
It's going good. I just wanted to call in. I left the church about 3 years ago. Me and my wife did. We ended up becoming Christian, which was an unexpected turn, but a really good one. And I was curious. So one of the biggest things that my mind began to change on was this idea of grace that is taught within the New Testament. And I was curious on your thoughts on the church's view of grace combined with works. Because I found that for me personally, it's completely subverted the message that's within the New Testament. And that message of grace is what really changed my life in a lot of ways. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that if you've thought about that.
Well, I guess the way I approach a lot of these theological questions is by first asking, beyond any argument about technicalities or what actually it is, like, what is it in principle that caused it to affect your life in a positive way? Like, when you reflect on this new conception of grace that you understand, what is it in your life that it gives you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I grew up in the church. My dad was a leader in the church for a long time, and kind of grew up in a glass house. And so I had this constant need to look perfect. That was like a constant for me in my life. And it was suffocating in a lot of ways. And so I had always thought that whenever I thought about God, I thought about somebody who was disappointed in me. So that was for me that theological difference of God himself, rather than sending someone else, right, rather than sending a volunteer, that God himself came down to not only forgive me, but to create a relationship with me. That completely changed my whole outlook and the lens by which I look at life.
So it sounds like in that old Mormon mode of being, there was a great deal of perfectionism, which would lead to shame, which would affect your mental well-being and would turn itself into a vicious cycle that I think a lot of people, particularly when they're hit with a great deal of religious scrupulosity, where there's a whole bunch of religious hoops and demands that you have to live up to, and your life becomes shaped by trying to fulfill those demands and be good and do everything right, and then you fail and you feel terrible about it, and that makes it harder to do good. And I think a lot of us in the ex-Mormon space can find some familiarity with that feeling. And then I can understand then why a concept of grace, which is not one that is framed by, hey, perfection is achievable and you're failing if you haven't gotten there yet, which particularly if you grew up in the, Spencer W. Kimball era, where he gave some talks saying that, you can be perfect. It suddenly gives you your life back because you start to realize that there's such a thing as good enough. And that takes away that head of, kind of psychological stress of the perfectionism that you get into that, cycle of toxic perfectionism. And I think the church has wrestled with that. And you can hear it in the talks of people like Jeffrey Holland, where he specifically says this cycle of toxic perfectionism is not one that we want to get into. And Dieter Uchtdorf has talked about it before as well, where he's tried to reframe the Mormon conception of grace. He, of course, uses an airplane analogy for that. But I think just stepping back and saying, well, what psychological benefit do you get from this new conception of grace? And this is not meant to take away from what spiritual meaning that gives you and what comfort it gives you from a theological perspective, but just from a pure psychological perspective. Because I think there's a lot of different things. These theological points, such as grace, they serve a narrative role in your life, in how you shape your life, how you see yourself in the world. And seeing yourself as having a degree of worthiness that involves imperfection. It allows you to forgive yourself, to operate in a mode that I think is ultimately healthier for you. And so there's a great deal of value in that. And to the extent that we're seeing some of the general authorities shift the Mormon conception of grace in that direction, I think there's an acknowledgement that that's going to be a healthier, better way for church members to frame that issue. And so for me, let's say that the church was shifting in that direction, and they were shifting it with a bunch of really cruddy scriptural references or interpretations, that conflicted with what the wider Christian world understands about those things. I don't even care. The only thing that really matters is for people who have been in that mode of perfectionism, if they have access to a concept of grace which can facilitate a better mode of existence and has that meaning to them and allows them to stay connected to their community of faith, I think that can be a good thing. And so for me, I think when you see different theological groups fight amongst each other about specifics about how you get to various things, that's less interesting to me than understanding how something like what you've described grace means to you in your life and how it facilitates your life. I think that's more important to me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and it's kind of interesting because it's an interesting experience, and I'm sure you talked about this many times before. I watched a lot of your videos, but when you leave the church, there's a group of people that want to welcome you, but I don't agree with their newfound lives, like going down the polyamorous route, or because I'm married, I have 3 kids, and or down the heavy drug use or the psychedelics, and I'm like, I don't really want to go down any of those. I don't, I have some friends that have changed their life by psychedelics, which is a good thing, but when I looked at that, I was like, that's not the path I want to go down. Like, I feel like that would simply continue to where the church leaders, whatever they said, would continue to dictate my life, because I would get upset about it, and I would get still involved in it, and it would still consume me. And
plus, I mean, a lot of those things, like, there are reasons to be cautious about making those life choices that don't have anything to do with religion or divine claims or restrictions based on prophet sayings. I mean, you can just look at, how long-term stability and happiness within a relationship, within a marriage. So, it's one of the things I've looked kind of on the hippie movement of the 1960s a little bit differently now, just because I can see, there's not too many of those hippie communes that are still in the same mode of existence out there now, because that way of life really does not have a long-term plan. Right. And a lot of the things that have been encoded into the religious and cultural traditions that we see here in the Western world exist because they've been able to pass intergenerationally, and the fact that they did pass intergenerationally was kind of the crucible of them standing the test of time, which means that they can promote a degree of stability and intergenerational prosperity. And it's not perfect, but it's the best system that we have so far. So there's some value to that from an evolutionary perspective, even if it comes with divine claims, because they may have worth even beyond the divine claims.
Right. Well, and that's one thing I'm fascinated with old stories. I always have been, and really getting into why did this story survive?
Yeah.
This story survived for a reason. Whether it's Beowulf and the Viking epics, or reading Greeks about the Greeks or the Spartans or Mesopotamia or the Bible. I think that there's so much value in those. And yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. I'm one who it takes me a long time to be able to express. Like, I feel like I understand something intuitively, where I'm like, I don't want to go that direction, I want to go this way. And it takes a long time to be able to explain it later. One thing that with the more broader Christian claims and the idea in the New Testament, not only of grace, but that the individual has value, because it seems like I would be curious to see what you think on this, and I don't want to take a ton of your time, but in the Old Testament, it was like you sacrifice the individual for the community. At least that's the pattern that I'm putting on it as I read that. And then in the New Testament, it was like through the salvation of the individual, you save the collective. Through like the individual finding grace and connection with God, then the collective is able to be saved. It just seems like there was a reverse there. I'd be curious to notice that.
Oh, that's an interesting read to see through that. I kind of, the same way we talked about how ideas have an evolutionary process that they survive in. Even something like the Bible, there's a form of evolutionary process, which is the stories that get told, because there are some stories that are in the Bible that really don't get told that much. And that can be because they don't serve a utility that's particularly helpful in an individual's life or in a society to be shaped by it. And so there's a lot of unknown baggage in the Bible that, people just don't talk about because it's not a very helpful story. But then you'll have other things like the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan and other stories that get told again and again and again. And that's because there's some utility to them. There's some principle that's being conveyed in the telling of it that does allow an individual and a society to somehow prosper and to get value from it. And so I think that for me, it's kind of like looking at why those stories get told and what meaning comes from that can really enrich a person's lives, that is importance. And that frees me then to not feel like I have to be married to the idea that, well, because something was in the Bible, I now have to incorporate it into my life, even if I don't understand or agree with it. And so observations about maybe a different mode of how a society should be shaped between the Old Testament and the New Testament is fascinating to imagine about and to wonder about. But I hesitate to see either of those things as a guiding moral principle that I should adopt uncritically. And I know that's not what you're trying to go for, but personally, I think that ideas evolve over time, and where in the past there has been a much more perhaps tribal perspective of how societies should be shaped, I tend to favor a notion of the prosperity of a society and justice being found in the preservation of the rights of the individual, and that if done at the individual level, then promotes wider prosperity for a whole society. I think that is a philosophy that I'm much more comfortable with. And there's this great series on YouTube called Justice, and it's philosopher Michael Sandel at Harvard, and you can watch like his course where he goes over a whole bunch of different moral and political philosophies and then just asks the students, well, what about this? What about this? And there's a point where he talks about utilitarianism, and one of the questions is like, if you go to the doctor and there's like a guy in the next room who, one guy needs a kidney, another guy needs lungs, another guy needs a heart, and another guy needs a liver. There's 4 different people, and you go to the doctor. Well, he could sacrifice your one life and save 4 lives. Why shouldn't he do that? Because that's the utilitarian principle, that, the greater good. And, so you kind of have to step back and say, well, some people might be fascinated by that and say, well, that's true. Then you can look at the world as both utilitarian and collectivist, because then the goods of the many outweigh the goods of the individual. But then apply that to the real world. If a doctor did that, well, people would stop going to the doctor because they would lose their own lives, because this doctor is there making decisions for the individual that, betray an individual's right to his own existence. And so translating that into the real world doesn't necessarily work. And for me, that was just kind of a really good model for how things like socialism and collectivism and communism sound really good in principle. But when you try to incorporate it into real humans, the undeniable fact that humans tend to prefer themselves and their own lives and their own well-being, and are opposed to their own personal suffering, that those different factors affect how such a game can be played.
Yeah. So I've got one last question, and I would be curious to see what you think about it. So after I left the church, I kind of wandered around for a while, and then my wife and I left together. Thank God, it turned out that way. And anyway, I ended up working with this. And it's a really, really long story, but I ended up meeting this pastor out in California. And they find exploited and missing kids. So kids stuck in human trafficking and kids who get kidnapped. And that's kind of what they focus on as their ministry. And long story short, about 2.5 years ago, I started being an operator with them as well, and started going out on these ops. And I go every couple of weeks, and I've seen a lot of stuff that's pretty horrific, and a lot of situations that you just can't believe it. Their mother selling the daughter, to a pimp in order to get meth. Like, situations like that are quite often. And I guess the reason I have my commitment to grace is because I've seen that idea work for someone in the worst situation. And the reason I bring that up is because, like, obviously they need a lot of help, and we do a lot of aftercare with kids. But I have noticed the success rate with, it's called CERT Ministries out of Temecula, California. But I've noticed CERT's success rate is so high compared to many of these other groups that do similar work. And I think it is because if if these girls that get taken out of this situation is so horrific and traumatic, and if their value is placed on themselves, then they can't. It seems really difficult for them to find footing, versus them being told, like, hey, you are loved by God, like you were fearfully and wonderfully made, and His grace is not only sufficient for you, but He's right here with you. And and I've just noticed, because we have quite a few success stories which are powerful and wonderful, and it seems that idea, because they get a Bible that's filled with all the good things that God says about them and all this stuff, and they get it surrounded by all these women that love on them, and they don't try to convert them, they don't get donations or anything like that. It's just they're just loved on, and I've seen that redemptive power of grace. And it's interesting to me, and I guess this is where I'm leading up to my question, is when someone doesn't have the resources, to go to a therapist or to visit someone else, I do think that because of their economic situation, I have seen that idea of grace and this idea that a loving God is actively pursuing you. That because that's the lesson taught within the New Testament, is like God's running after you, and He's interested in having a relationship with you, and through the virtue of that relationship, when you trust on that, you could call it like an archetypal relationship, if we're using psychological language, that through that trust in a transcendent relationship, they seem to be able to get through their problems a lot better than those who don't have that. And that's like the most, like when, my whole philosophy is that if it works in the extremes, then it usually works in the more mundane as well. So like as I'm raising my kids, and I have 2 girls and a boy, and it's like raising them with this idea of grace, that they're always loved, and that no matter what happens, that their dad's going to be there, and I'm never disappointed in things like results. But we're always pushing for effort. Anyway, I'm talking too much.
I think that there's something powerful in what you're describing, where there are ways of seeing your relationship to the divine, your relationship to the world around you, your relationship to even just the concept of love and the concept of human dignity and self-worth, that are conveyed in religious language through the concept of grace that you're talking about, that can have very powerful psychological effects in an individual's ability to overcome challenges, to move from a position of abuse and move into a mode of recovery for that. And if people have found that to be helpful for them, particularly if it comes with a community of supportive and loving people, then I think that that's something powerful to contend with, to acknowledge. And I think the other side of that, from those in the ex-Mormon space, there's one video that I've seen around on TikTok every once in a while of, as young kids frequently do, they've turned on the recorder and they're talking to their dad and saying, why can't you love me without God? And the young person is kind of acting like a victim, like they're so downtrodden. Yu-Gi-Oh! But then you can hear the dad say, but to me, God is love. And so my love for you is conveyed through the language and messaging of God. And when we're in that really angry phase of the church and feeling betrayed and lied to and seeing the church as just a mechanism of control and oppression, it can be very easy to hear a loved one say that and to be very hurt and very offended and feel the sting of that. And hopefully over time, after you soften that after you transition from that phase of anger, then you can listen to somebody that you care about, like your dad, telling you that, and you can say, okay, you know what, that is their language and conception of love. And it includes a notion of God. And I understand, because I was raised in that tradition, the degree of compassion that comes along with that. And even if I don't agree with that framing, even if I don't personally claim that framing, I can still understand what is trying to be conveyed through that expression. And I think moving from this very critical, finding problems at every point, to a much more unifying, understanding meaning in the way that our church member family may be talking to us, and allowing the meaning that they're carrying with it to maintain that connection on a personal level, and to find worth and find value in that is really useful. And I'm hoping that more people will adopt that. And that's one of the concerns I have about kind of the ways a lot of different places in ex-Mormon content creation go, is that they continue to catastrophize, and they say, oh, it's so terrible, it's so bad, there's all this oppression, all this stuff. But it's like, at what point do we shift to a mode of healing? And what point do we shift our mindset from only looking at the problems, only magnifying the problems, and taking the worst interpretation of anything that may go on? When do we shift the mindset and model for other people, hey, there's a way to look at what's being done or what's being said in a positive way that increases our connection to the people that we care about, without it having to turn into an argument? And I think that hopefully we can start to see more modeling of that type of behavior.
Yeah, I agree with that. And can I share something with you that actually ended up making my relationship with my parents way better?
What's that?
So I do a lot of prayer and meditation, and I had this idea that popped in my head right before I did meditation one night, and it was I was like, I wonder how I feel differently about my parents if I envision them as children and going to visit them in their home as a kid. And I know that sounds weird.
But when you say envision them as children, you mean yourself as a child or them as a child?
So, no, them as a child and me as an adult. And so I went to through this meditative process that I follow. I went to my dad's home, and I saw him, and I saw his earnestness to do the right thing, and and it was a very I have strong. I have a talent for meditation and being able to see things in my meditation. And so it was so interesting because I was so upset with them at the time, and then but seeing my dad as like a 5-year-old kid and playing with him in this meditation, I all of a sudden felt like, oh, he's just doing his best. And then I did the same with my mother, and it was like I walked away with it with so much more grace. And even when they would have, the typical kind of emotional outbursts as we were leaving the church, and I felt like I could still see them that way, and not to be patronizing in any way, but to just understand where they were coming from and not see their attacks as like a personal attack on me. Mm-hmm. But that me leaving the church wasn't a personal, what they interpreted that as a personal attack on them. And that's okay because of their framework and where they're coming from. And I don't have to try to change them. It was, but for some reason that meditation changed something in the way that I viewed all my interactions from that point on, where I stopped taking it so personal and I started seeing them as just as people. I know that sounds weird, but I just saw them rather than as my parents. I'm like, this is just a person, and they're doing their best. And I don't. Yeah,
and it's funny because you're kind of projecting or mirroring the way that I think a lot of ex-Mormons want their family to see them. Because a lot of ex-Mormons will say that our parents, perceive everything as an attack or something like that, and we just are trying to be understood. And so you're actually kind of giving them what many of us have been wanting to receive from our parents in terms of understanding and patience and a form of respect in terms of allowing people to be who they are.
Yeah.
So that's a great story.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, hey, thanks for letting me come on the program. I've never seen you live before, so as soon as I saw it and the phone numbers up, I'm like, I gotta hop on this.
Well, I appreciate your call. I don't do this as frequently anymore. But it's always fun when I get a chance to. All right, Dave. Thanks. Have a good one. Bye. All right. Okay, so let's see here. I better get to the last point. Activism. This is the one that's not actually an ideology, but it's the same sort of thing where and I did this myself. I described myself and what I did as activism, and I started to see how activism gets framed in this way where you know what is right and you're trying to change the world. You're trying to get the world to conform to what you believe. And then there's social dynamics that happen with that too, because you've got other people who are cheering you on. You've got other people who are doing their own activism, and it creates this social web that carries its own incentives and its own punishments and its own expectations. And it carries a bias. It's harder for you to step back and see the humanity of other people and to rein in some of the more radicalizing impulses. Because anytime you get into a social group with other people where there's a moral framework of what is good and what is not good, then you are prone to purity spirals where people compete with projecting better goodness and more goodness, and that includes then demonizing your enemies even further and dehumanizing them. And it's just one of these things where any movement that you get involved in is going to have these impulses, and you've got to realize them in the movement itself and in yourself. And you have to step back and say, hold on a second, what am I doing? Where are we going with this? And so I kind of frame what I do more, instead of as activism, in a mode that's not, I guess, there's a word for it that I use that I can't remember right now, but it's much more in the mode of persuasion and dialogue rather than demanding that the world change to conform to what you think is right. Because if we are acting more in the mode of persuasion and dialogue, then we're open to seeing our own faults. We're open to seeing where ideas that maybe we thought were right and ways that we thought the world should be shaped and formed by, well, maybe that's not actually in practice going to be the utopia that we thought it was. And I think in a lot of the excesses of many of these different movements, if there's that humility about the extent to which the great utopia anticipated by each of those movements can be achieved, then some of the more radicalizing and extreme components of those movements may be softened. So anyway, that is well, I guess what I had wanted to cover a little bit was, so I posted this meme in the Mormon Stories podcast group, and immediately there were a lot of people saying some negative things about the meme itself, about me personally. And it's one of those things that I was, essentially attacked. I was called a transphobe and a bigot. And it's really tempting to say, look, I've been persecuted because I put this meme up and people called me bad names and said bad things. That mode of seeing that I've been persecuted and having that feel like I've been justified and I'm right and I can go even with stronger. Well, that social dynamic, that individual psychological dynamic, is one of the circuits that can drive people towards more radicalization in any of these things. And so I think just being aware that that dynamic exists and trying to hold off from indulging in it and keeping things on an even keel is what I'm trying to do a little bit more. And that's kind of why I don't have as many fiery and reactionary videos on my channel, perhaps as I used to. And I think some of that is, you can only do this for so long before you do need to grow and expand and have more life experience and get on with the work of living, which is what we should all be doing. And so, get some good influences in your life, get some good hobbies, good things that you enjoy doing that connect you with people that you love that are in your real life existence. We're seeing social media and computers and technology gradually replace more and more of that type of social connection. And so you've got to kind of recognize that happening and move to reclaim some of those real interactions in your life. So for me, a lot of that is this card game called Yu-Gi-Oh! And I use it as an open door for me to connect with my family, with my kids, with my brothers. And it's something that we have fun doing. Just find your Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, that's why my dog is called Yu-Gi-Oh! But find something that you love, that connects you to the people in your life, and really focus on that and give that a good go. And I think we can all benefit from that type of real human interaction. So With that being said, I think we'll go ahead and close it down. And until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Bye now.